All right, welcome everyone today. I'm really excited to have Stephen Gatchell, who is our VP of Data and AI Strategy here at BigID with us today as we begin our thought leadership series on AI TRiSM or Trust, Risk, and Security Management. So I'm really looking forward to digging into this topic, looking at it from a business perspective here today with one of our premier thought leaders on this subject at BigID. So, Stephen, welcome. Thank you for giving us some time here. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. I'm looking forward to this discussion. It's a hot topic for sure. So my name's Stephen Gatchell. I've been with Big ID for about 3 years. I'm living in the Boston area, if you can't tell by my accent. Usually that comes out during the conversations. And before joining Big ID, I was with companies like EMC and Dell and most recently Bose, actually developing data strategies, managing teams from an AI strategy perspective, such as data scientists, data engineering, data governance, partnering with our privacy and security teams. So AI TRiSM is near and dear to my heart and something that I've been executing for years, even though we didn't call it AI TRiSM back then.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that introduction. So, Stephen, one of the things that I realize just in my day-to-day life is that AI, it's everywhere, right? We use it every day, even if we're really not aware that we're using it. And the one thing I'm also noticing in talking with customers is how they're using it in really creative and innovative ways to deliver value externally to their customers, but also in their own footprint of operations. So when we think about AI, and more specifically, how do we secure and make sure that we're treating the data that AI uses properly? AI trust, risk, and security management is a really important topic, right? And so let's start at the foundation for all those people who might not be super familiar with the topic. Tell us, at a high level, what is it that we're talking about when we say AI TRiSM?
Yeah, so it's how people and consumers of AI are using AI in a responsible manner. It's really a framework. And when you look at a framework and you talk about things like trust as an example, how can people trust utilizing AI and getting the output that they expect and then be able to actually execute on that output, right? So that's part of trust. Or as a consumer of the enterprises, how are they using my data trustfully, right? Are they actually protecting my information? Every day it seems like I get a new letter in the mail to sign up for protection, right? Because my data has been exposed somewhere. And that's just not a good look. It's not protecting the consumer data and it's not protecting the enterprise itself, and consumers will start walking away from companies that don't protect their data. If you talk about from a risk perspective, internally the landscape of risk from an AI perspective has now expanded. The attack surface is much larger now inside of enterprises, both on the security side because of things like generative AI and understanding prompts and so forth. So there's these new pieces of consumers and the way people utilize AI that expands the attack surface. Also, from a risk, you have to think about the privacy side of things. There's a lot of regulations across the globe. The US has 20 different ones in specific states because we don't have a federal mandate yet. There's some guidelines at the federal level in the US, but certainly not as strong as, say, a GDPR in Europe is, right? Um, and so forth. So there's the privacy risk, the security risk, in the trust itself, and then how people are actually using the data and the consumers that are using the information has changed as well. So to your point earlier, AI is everywhere. My daughter's going to college next year. She's a rising high school senior, and one of my questions I asked during a tour just this weekend, I'm like, "What are you guys doing from an AI policy standpoint?" Right? It's truly everywhere, and I think the more that we, as consumers, understand what those risks are, how companies are protecting our data from utilizing the data incorrectly, what are the different global regulations, how are schools, how are enterprises using it, it's all over the map, right?
Yeah, very interesting. Well, thank you for describing that and setting kind of that context at a higher level. I think that's really helpful, at least for me too. I'm learning about this as I get to the opportunity to interview you. So when we talk about AI TRiSM, right, I'm picking out three key elements. You got trust, you
Mhm.
got risk, and security. So can you go a little bit deeper into those three elements? What do they actually mean?
Yeah, so look, let's start with trust. So trust, you have it from multiple levels. I've already mentioned how do you protect your consumer data itself, but also trust is internal to organizations. So you mentioned earlier, as you're in tools, you may just use a summary of something instead of reading the full detail. Can you trust that that summary is actually pulling out the pertinent information that you want, or do you go and read the whole document and realize the summary is not what it was? Or
Hmm.
if you're utilizing different tool sets and you're prompting something, the data is from the internet in some of these large language models, right? And is the data actually correct? Do you trust that information? If you're building stuff inside as a vendor of BigID, right? We're building these types of capabilities inside of our tool, and we want to make sure that when our customers prompt something inside of BigID, that we're actually returning the accurate information, the level of quality. So there's two components of trust there. It's how are you using data, and then can the end user actually trust the information and the responses that they're getting?
Hmm. So it's the
Um,
classic kind of garbage in, garbage out type of problem.
100%. And with AI, specifically generative AI, let's take that for a second. It gets worse if you think about it, because you can actually have people put in bad information into prompts. And as those prompts are being put in, and that data can then be utilized to actually train the model. So
Hmm.
if you think about it, I talked about attack surface. So we talked about the security piece and the risk piece. These tie together in my mind, but we separate them out in TRiSM acronym. The security piece is if I have a model that I have 10,000 users utilizing it, take a ChatGPT or some other type of tool, for instance, and we have bad actors that are uploading incorrect information into the prompt. That LLM can then utilize that information and actually start spitting out bad information as well. So I think what the process is from a production standpoint on the risk and the security piece as well is, do you have the right security in place to do things like block toxic combinations from a prompt, which means if somebody as a bad actor is putting information into a prompt, can we block that and not actually have it ingest into the model? Or can I actually look at my large language model, my LLM's results from a generative AI prompt and say, this information is very good. Check. Let that go. This information, what we call kind of hallucinations, if you will. A
Right.
hallucination is just you put in a prompt and the thing just goes up and makes up stuff, right? So the difference in generative AI is these models can actually make up new data. So even if you didn't train the model to output something, it could actually come to that conclusion on its own, if you will. It learns from itself and its processes. So understanding things like hallucinations from an LLM model on a response could give a person bad information, and then they go making business decisions on that bad information. That's going to be a problem. So that's a major
No
risk
problem.
there, right? And then let's go to the security piece. So when we talk about security is, for instance, people are now signing up and using their credit cards and just using different types of GPTs, right? And just because either the company has a policy where you can't use any external generative AI applications, or they just figure it's making my job easier, so therefore I'm going to slap down the $20 a month or whatever the cost is on some of these. And so there's a huge security risk, because if that person is not trained properly and they're uploading private information, by the way, this is both personal and professional, right? So this isn't just about the enterprise either. This is about your own personal data. So, if I want to go and, for instance, use a public model and say, I want to understand my financial risk profile on my retirement fund, and I start uploading my financial statements and my retirement fund, not, from a security and privacy perspective, that's not a good thing to do. So I think when we deep dive into these things, you have to think about, from an enterprise perspective, what type of framework do I want to utilize to go and make sure that the way I'm implementing these capabilities is secure? Do I
Mhm.
actually have information to help educate the end users on how to use it properly? Is the second piece. From a personal perspective, am I actually understanding, like, what is an LLM? can it actually create poor data on its own and actually understand that? And so you'll see some of these tools now, they'll put little disclaimers on the bottom. This
Hmm.
information can generate, could be actually false information. So how do you actually educate people on how to prompt properly? So you can do things like, hey, do not make up stuff. Only give me hard facts back and things of that nature. So when you cut across all of those TRiSM pieces, it's a combination of what does my new application look like, and do I have the right guardrails in place? Did
Hmm.
I educate my consumer of that product properly so that they understand the implications and what these things can and cannot do? And then the third piece is how do I have those guardrails actually executed to actually block and help consumers protect from themselves?
Hmm. Fascinating. Well, thank you for explaining that. That adds a lot more clarity to me on what we're actually talking about when we talk about trust, risk, and security management. So, Stephen, one of the things that I'm really curious about is I know you're a thought leader in this space and you spend a lot of time talking with other business leaders about this topic specifically. So, I'm really curious, when we talk about AI TRiSM, what does it actually mean in the marketplace? And like, what
Yeah.
are the types of things you're seeing and hearing about it out there in the field?
Yeah, so what it actually means is how are we using these modern technologies in a safe and responsible way? Okay, so responsible AI is a phrase that is being utilized in the marketplace today, and there's a lot of different blogs and white papers and so forth on this topic. And so when I talk to other leaders, their thought process is, how can I utilize these capabilities in a safe and responsible way? So what does that actually mean?
Hmm.
Uh, if you turn on a co-pilot, as an example, a lot of companies are turning on what we call co-pilots. Those are basically ways to understand your knowledge-based systems, right? All of that historical information of that your ex-employees or your current employees have, your partners have, and be able to train on that information and be able to get answers out quickly and accurately. So when you look at something like that, as you go deeper into TRiSM, the capabilities of turning on a co-pilot and then realizing after the fact you didn't have good foundational capabilities at the data level to say protect restricted data that's going in. So this concept around labeling data as an example. And typically there's four different levels. Sometimes there's five where you say these documents contain information that is restricted information. I don't want that being results in my co-pilots, right? I want to block all that. So literally these leaders are trying to figure out how do I balance the speed of innovation and allow to be turned on co-pilot, but also have my foundational capabilities in place where I'm actually protecting the data and I don't have any uh-ohs, right? So, um, as I talk to customers, they're all over the map from a maturity perspective, right? And prospects, customers, partners, et cetera. There are some companies that turn on co-pilots as an example in very small groups, and they're usually technology-minded people that they're allowing to start testing these things so that if there are those uh-ohs where we're not labeling our documents properly, as an example. So
Hmm.
discovering, building a catalog, understanding what's restricted, actually labeling those documents, and then training the co-pilots to say, don't return this from a prompt. So therefore it's restricted and nobody has access to this. Because
Right.
if you think about it now, like you have these file shares and so forth, sometimes, I'm not saying we do this, Greg, right? But sometimes you create a document and you say, okay, share this file externally or share it internally across the entire company. And it probably
Mhm.
should not have been secured that way. So as we turn on these things like copilots, it finds this information. And if it's an open document and it's marked as public, as an example, it's going to use that in the response.
Mhm.
So I think there's a balance here where leaders across the globe that are responsible at the security, the privacy, and the data risk layers, right? So you're talking about CISOs and CDOs and chief privacy officers. They're trying to figure out what is my risk tolerance level, and then how fast do I want to turn on or off? How many people are going to give access to this information? Do I have the good foundational levels? What's my maturity level? There's so many things to think about. And so as they go through, they're looking at where do I want to turn this on, meaning geographically, right? Because you have different regulations across the globe.
Right.
Some countries are much easier than others from a regulatory perspective. And so you have to think about things like what is the potential fine versus what is my risk tolerance level of reducing my speed of innovation. That's on the privacy side. On the security side, you may have on-prem versus cloud, like most companies have, right? They have both on-prem and cloud. Maybe you're a little more secure, or you think you're more secure on your on-prem, and you don't have the confidence on cloud. By the way, it's usually the opposite, but I
Right.
think cloud's more secure than the on-prem most of the times. But maybe you turn on the knowledge-based system on-prem because you have more confidence in your security level versus allowing anything that's in the cloud space. So from a security and a risk posture landscape and attack surface, you kind of
Mhm.
limit what these things have access to. I mentioned already around things like data literacy. Most companies have a yearly security class that you have to take, like literally every year. You click through, there's stories, all that good stuff on
Yeah.
security. I think data literacy should be one of those things that we need to have go forward. I don't see that in the marketplace adopted very frequently yet, but we're starting to see traction around that. So every year now, maybe you're going to have some data governance education, which sounds frightening to people because they usually run in the other direction when they hear data governance, but we'll say it's AI governance and then people will get excited about it.
There you
So
go, right?
so there's all these different components to think about, like size and scale of release production, size and scale of training data that you're actually going to open up those to, size and scale of individuals using it, maturity level of your organization, et cetera.
Very good. So you hit on a couple things there that I think are really fascinating, and that is, in your examples, you're talking a lot about documents, knowledge-based content, and things like that that's feeding in. That's largely unstructured or semi-structured data, right? Does that add a bit more challenge to identifying something like PII within that data and being able to protect it?
Yeah, I mean, most companies, especially, if you do traditional financial or healthcare, they've been regulated for a while.
Mhm.
But they focus on the structured data because that's where their processes are, if you will, right? So your CRM systems, your Salesforce systems, your billing systems that are sitting inside of SAP or whatever application you're talking about. And quite honestly, there's some maturity there on the structured side. With AI, unstructured is a critical capability. It could be unstructured of documents, it could be pictures, it could be voice recordings, it could be biometrics. You have all these other different capabilities on the unstructured side. So there's a couple problems with this. One is on unstructured, the security piece of it was not as focused as on the structured side, meaning you have a OneDrive or you have whatever storage capability you have, SharePoint Online, et cetera. How many times do people copy presentations and documents across they take them from their own personal and they put them on a public share or whatever they do there. So that's problem number one. I think the security aspect on the unstructured has not been as focused as unstructured for sure. I think the second piece on unstructured is the size and the scope of it. So if you think about, there's been statistics, and you can Google this, right? It's 80 or 90% of all data in the world is unstructured. So think about how many photos do you take on a weekend trip with your
Right.
family, right? That's unstructured data. Or how many PDF files and presentations are created and copied on a daily basis? How many we record every meeting now, it seems these days,
Mhm.
right? So voice recordings of meetings and so forth could be 80 to 90%. We're talking about petabytes and soon in the marketplace, exabyte scale on the
Yeah.
unstructured side. So, a couple things just to summarize there. One, you don't have the security protocols that you do on structured data typically. Two, the ease, especially in the cloud environments of copying things across different repositories, much easier than what it was in the past on the structured side. The third piece I would say is the size and the scale and the scope of it. So if you have to go into petabytes and someday exabyte scale of data, how do you do that at scale to identify where is my PII data? But we also got to
Mhm.
talk about IP data, right? Intellectual property data and custom, what we call custom classifiers, where it's not good enough anymore just to say, hey, there's date of birth and there's social security number in this PDF. We now have to understand things like, hey, there's code of repository that's externally accessible. And that code, by the way, is the backbone of our product. So how do we protect that? So it's IP, PI. I will just kind of summarize those as sensitive data.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. So, I think, in listening to all the things you're discussing here today, it's pretty clear, right? Trust is absolutely critical because business leaders want to use AI to help them make better decisions. Business leaders in general are risk averse because it opens up potential for bad things to happen within a business. So we got to be very careful about risk. And data security is critical in any business, in any industry. So if I'm interested in developing a program around this to help set my business up for scalable usage of AI and making it something we can trust, reduce risk, and secure, I mean, where do I even start to develop an AI TRiSM program?
Yeah, so first things first, we mentioned earlier about the different personas, right? We talked about there's CDOs, there's chief privacy officers, and there's CISOs or CIOs or whatever the titles are, right? But you usually have security, privacy, and data perspectives.
Mhm.
When you look at those three, the first thing I always ask customers, are these groups talking? First question, is there like an AI committee, a data committee that you guys get into a room and talk about these challenges?
Uh-huh.
I think that's extremely vital, especially the acceleration of AI, right? I think in the past, if you did not have this, you could have these different repositories of data that can be utilized and utilized somewhat safely and so forth. I think with AI and the opening of things like copilots, and now we haven't even mentioned agentic AI yet.
Right.
But with the advent of agentic AI, which is basically how do we allow AI to go do things on its own and learn from it itself? You have to have these personas get into a room and talk about one, what are the business use cases? Like, what do we define as what good looks like? Where are we going to focus in on the business use cases? That's step one. Step two is how do I evaluate what our risk tolerance level is? So in some cases, you may accept risk because the speed of innovation actually outweighs the risk that you're accepting. Very plausible there, right? So identify and make sure that everybody in those three areas and there's other areas too, right? Your technology teams, your data teams, but you get the idea where you bring
Mhm.
the stakeholders in. You talk about things like risk tolerance. Once you do that, then you understand, okay, I've got my business use case. I understand what the risk is. I understand what the maturity level of that business use case. Are we ready or not? And then you start actually building out these business use cases at a small scale, right? Don't just go and try and figure out, I'm going to go and have 15 different models implemented next week across the environment, and I don't even understand my risk tolerance across those 15 business use cases. Then you start actually utilizing processes and technologies and frameworks. So we haven't talked about frameworks yet, but frameworks such as NIST and ISO and CDMC and DCAM, and there's a million different frameworks out there, quite frankly. But what they're all trying to do is give you a framework that actually gives you what are the business rules to implement AI and data across security, privacy, and data securely and responsibly, right? So it talks about things, all the things that we talked about today. It talks about how do I manage my data at the data level safely? Building data catalogs and understanding what does my data landscape look like across structured and unstructured. But now we also have to think about vector databases and AI models.
Mhm.
So you start thinking about, okay, I got to build a data catalog to even know what's even out there. And you
Mhm.
start doing that on small scale and building a factory. Then I need to know what type of data is in all those because I need to understand my risk. So is it IP data? Is it PI data? Or is it public data that I don't even care about and I can just let people go nuts with that information, right? So you
Right.
start understanding and classifying and labeling data, like I talked about earlier with the Copilot use case. Once you do that, you start evaluating where your critical risk is. Because I think, especially in most organizations, the amount of data they have is a very large scale. So therefore, you're going to find probably a lot of personal information and IP data that needs protection and what we call remediation, right?
Mhm.
So how do I identify those risks and then start prioritizing where do I need to go and remediate, meaning resolve those risks so they're no longer a risk. And examples like that could be I want to move data from a less secure repository to a much more secure repository. It could be I want to mask data, right? Meaning you can't actually see the data, but you mask it. You might replace it with a classifier name versus the actual social security number, as an example. There's so many ways to protect it. We talk about inside of BigID rot data all the time, redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. How do I remove that data that has sensitive information to reduce my risk landscape, both from a security, privacy, and privacy perspective there? So you go through, you scan and identify, build a catalog, you start classifying, you start remediation, which comes along with ownership. That's another
Hmm.
challenging topic. Who owns what data and how are they expected to be a data owner and what does remediation actually mean and process and the most critical pieces? And then how do you actually do this on an ongoing basis? So it's not a one-time thing. These are not projects, these are programs. So
Right.
I go through and I remediated and I reduce my privacy and my security risk, but then I ingest terabytes more data, or I acquire a company, or I want to build a new AI model and I want to assess what the risk around that AI model is. So things like compliance to both regulations and those frameworks I talked about, and how do you do that on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, that's a key point, right? These are not projects, they're programs. I like that. And setting yourself up for ongoing usage of your program and having all the guardrails and things that you speak of in place would be critical to doing this over and over again at scale. So that's really helpful because I think, when I look at a topic like this, which is kind of broad and expansive, it can be daunting. So I like your advice about starting small, picking out a use case that delivers value to your business, and building the program around that. Because I think, figuring out where to begin can be the hardest part sometimes. But when we
Yeah,
talk about like
so sorry,
building, oh, go
one
ahead.
other quick thing, right? I would say too, because I don't want to leave this part out.
Uh-huh.
When we talk about starting small and doing a use case, I mean delivering it all the way through what I call the last mile
Mhm.
in production. So what we see a lot is tons of AI use cases and people check the box and say we have victory because we implemented the use case, but it's actually not in production yet. Doing something in a lab versus production, two totally different things. So sorry to interrupt, but I should have mentioned that
No,
in
that's a
case.
great point to make. Thank you for doing that. So okay, then going back to where kind of my head is at with this, I want to build a program. I see the value. I know I'm going to need to get the right people, the right team in place to be able to be successful. So, like, what resources, what skills should I be looking for in my team to be able to do this?
Yeah, so first I would say, depending upon the team will depend upon the skill set, right? But as an overall AI strategy, like let's talk about that AI governance team I talked about, the cross-functional team of security, privacy, and data and
Hmm.
governance, right? When you have those groups in a room, those are the kind of the perspectives that you need. So you do need security people that are going to think about things like how do I understand what my risk landscape is, my attack surfaces are, and as we build AI models, what does that mean for my customers? So if I'm putting in a product, do I have the right and security in place for my product and so forth? So you're going to have product security teams, you're going to have data product individuals. You need those individuals to understand not only traditional security, but we'll see more and more applications where security is actually using AI to increase the security of their data and AI models, right?
Hmm.
So you need security focused individuals that have kept up with the modern technologies and understanding of how to use AI to secure your AI environment. On the privacy side, traditionally what I see on the privacy side is you may have somebody with a legal background and in fact, chief privacy officers are often lawyers. They
Hmm.
have a business focus, not necessarily a technical focus. So I always recommend on the privacy or the compliance side, you have to have a combination of, that person that understands and can translate the regulations into what are those actual business rules that we need to follow and how do we execute those. But you need some technical skill set in that group too. So once I have those business rules translated, how do I then help my security team translate those into execution?
Hmm.
That's really hard. So when you look at things like the EU AI Act and it says things like you can't build models that are going to be harmful to humans. Okay, great. From a legal perspective, you got to translate that. But then how do I actually execute that in my security space and my tool sets, right? So having some technical capabilities on the privacy side and those
Hmm.
individuals that can balance that business and technical, super helpful. You certainly need somebody on the governance side. And when we talk about governance, there is two different perspectives here. There's data governance and AI governance. And in the marketplace, those can be two different skill sets, quite frankly, right? In some companies, they're smashing those together a little bit, but in a lot,
Mhm.
how do you manage data repositories and traditional data sets, and even on the unstructured side, versus AI models? So the life cycle of an AI model and the skill set that you need to do that is different than data lifecycle management. The concepts are the same, but the execution to in production are different. So I think you need people both on the data space and understanding good foundational data management capabilities and following things like DCAM and CDMC and other frameworks. But you
Mhm.
also need people that have the AI governance perspective that are going to understand and be able to translate the EU AI Privacy Act, working with the privacy team. What does that mean for an actual model itself? Because that's a little bit different. And then you need somebody, quite honestly, that kind of cuts across, like who's that AI governance person that owns that leadership team that can connect the dots across security, privacy, and data. I see that missing, quite honestly, in most companies right now. The person that can connect the dots and translate what is the security language versus the privacy language versus the data language, and then how do we bring those together to go execute something? And then the last thing I'll say on resources is, agents are now going to be treated as quote unquote employees or execution things. So a lot of tools now will have agents inside of the tools. And so as you build that AI governance committee, understanding human versus computer, if you will, or agents, and who's managing what and who owns what. Because an agent can actually own and execute things like, I'm going to go find all the different attack surfaces across my RAG environment, my retrieval
Mhm.
augmented generation environment, because we're creating our own models, right? So I'm going to have an agent that's going to go across that entire landscape and highlight all of the security risk and then go and remediate those. You have to
Mhm.
manage the agents too. So now you have to have an individual that can connect the dots across security, privacy, data, and understand how to manage agents as well as the human input,
Mhm.
the human in the loop, if you will. So I know I said a lot there, but it's a very complex question.
It
Um,
is.
and then most people are like, okay, well, how many headcounts do I need for all this? And I'm not answering that on this call.
That's okay. I'm not going to hold you to that, but it's a fascinating set of skills that you really need a cross-functional team coming from a lot of different domains of expertise to make this work, which is it's really interesting. So let's say we've done the work, we've picked out a great use case that we're going to build a team around, and we're going to drive that all the way through to production. How do we look at outcomes, right?
Mhm.
When I think about programs, um, I need to have clearly defined targets and KPIs that help us measure kind of where we're at. In an AI TRiSM program, what does success look like to you, and how would you go about measuring it?
Yeah, so OKRs and KPIs I think should be defined up front from the business use case itself, right? What does success look like from an implementation? So if I turn on a co-pilot, am I measuring efficiency of individuals? Has it increased or decreased? Can I give more responsibility to those that are using co-pilots? Auto code generation is a huge topic right now, and we see numbers like increasing efficiency of developers for 30 to 40%. Okay, so I think you have to measure those OKRs for use cases or KPIs for use cases right from the get-go to see if you're successful or not. From a TRiSM perspective, it could be all over the map. So, and this is quite honestly a challenge for each company because we talk about things like hard savings and soft savings for utilizing and implementing things like AI technology. A hard saving meaning I can actually cut costs to the bottom line, right? I can take money because I've saved it and put it on product development as an example. That's a hard savings. Whereas a soft saving is more like, hey, I made this person more efficiently so we could just give them more work, right? I'm not gonna reduce the salary, so to speak, to go execute something. And so let's take security, for instance. When I look at security, if I'm utilizing AI and I can actually have a risk dashboard that shows everything that BigID, for instance, has scanned and identified from classifying, and I can see the security risk, clear text passwords, tokenization keys that are in code and things of that nature. And then I can measure risk over time and show I'm remediating things at scale, and I can see that risk literally go down. I mean, that's the type of measurement that you want. And I think as you kind of start implementing things like agents and automation and so forth, what is that actually saving you? And did I accelerate my risk going down because I was doing this process and I built a process from end to end, and now I can automate it and have human in the loop in some cases or fully autonomous? Did I actually increase my risk reduction because I've now have agents that are doing some of the work in automation, right? So literally like setting baselines. Today I do a manual process from a security perspective of TRiSM because I'm going in and maybe I'm scanning and then I have somebody review the remediation path. And then I have somebody clicking buttons to go and actually remove overprivileged permissions from that remediation, et cetera. To maybe I build an automated process, right? And that helps to now I have an agent that can then actually go and learn and solve additional problems. So
Mm,
set a baseline, measure over time. If you look at the privacy perspective, what is the percentage and chances of paying a regulatory fine? So quite frankly, discussions typically are like, well, we're not going to get a fine because we have all the right regulations and frameworks in place and we're doing the right things. I would argue if you're not allocating certain dollars for fines, when you actually get that fine, it's going to hit the bottom line pretty hard. So measuring things like allocation of dollars to paying fines, as an example, can I lower that because I'm reducing my privacy risk because I've not only understood all of the regulations across the globe that I need to pertain to, but I now
mhm,
have scanned my environment and I know the jurisdiction of my data. And
mhm.
where there's jurisdiction of data and it's in the incorrect place because now I'm violating some regulation in a certain country, I've resolved that. I've lowered my risk, and I have a process that can keep that risk lowered from a regulatory fine.
Yeah.
Um, if there's a breach on the security side, if I have all of my data protected, and this is actually a true customer story, by the way, there was a breach at one of our customers. Of course, I will not say the name, but the breach didn't affect anything because that environment that got breached was actually scanned and classified and protected, remediated, if you will. So the data
Mhm,
that they got access to was actually public data, right? All of the PI data and IP data was actually protected. So there was no incident. They didn't have to go to their customers. They didn't have to go to regulators and say there was a breach and here's the impact to it. They didn't
mhm.
have to go send a letter to their customers saying you got to sign up for protection of your personal data because we had a breach. So measurements like that, where you want to measure risk over time, set a baseline, measure risk over time. Absolutely. And I think it's really smart to do it separately, meaning focus on the governance, the privacy, and the data security risks, and then kind of aggregate those up to a corporate risk. Because as you go out and you start reporting to your senior executives and so forth, they quite honestly sometimes they don't want to get in the weeds, right? So is my
Right.
risk going up or down as we're implementing AI models? That's what they want to know. And if you can get
Mhm,
to that point of aggregation across your perspectives of security, privacy, and data,
mhm,
not now you're working with something. And so I think, that's where tool sets like BigID obviously come
mhm.
into play where you can start automating some of those measurements over time and seeing your risk go up or down and then be able to actually explain why. If it goes down, I've remediated these types of data sets or these types of risk profiles. Or perhaps sometimes it will go up because we did an acquisition or we bought third-party data that brought in new risk and be able to explain it. That's amazing stuff because then you can take action on that and figure out what to do.
Fantastic. Well, you've got a lot of expertise on this topic, and I myself have learned a lot throughout this discussion, Stephen. So I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your experience. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. And if you have any more questions about this topic on AI TRiSM, please feel free to reach out to us through BigID University or attend one of our BigID University office hours sessions, and we can go into this topic in a little bit more detail and discuss it with you. Stephen, thank you so much. And all of our viewers, thank you for your time.